The royals owe me. Harry owes me. Meghan owes me. What I've been through, I should be rewarded for. It's time to look after Daddy.
Something has shifted, and once you hear the pattern, it becomes hard to look at this story the same way again. 3 people, 3 very different relationships, 3 entirely separate histories with Meghan Markle. Yet somehow, despite coming from different places and carrying different emotions, they all seem to describe the same experience. This is not about one loud family argument. It is not about one explosive moment that changed everything overnight. It is about something slower, colder, and far more unsettling. A connection reduced little by little, a conversation that becomes harder to reach, a bond that fades not in one public collapse, but in small repeated moments until almost nothing remains. And that is what makes this so striking. Thomas Markle, Doria Ragland, and Samantha Markle are not coming from the same perspective. They do not share the same role in Meghan's life, and they certainly do not carry the same personal history. But when people with such different vantage points begin outlining a similar pattern, it forces a different kind of question. Maybe this is not random conflict. Maybe this is not simply bad timing, misunderstanding, or the normal fallout of fame. Maybe what they are describing is something more deliberate, something built, something maintained. Start with Thomas Markle, because his story lays the groundwork for everything that followed. For years, the public was handed a very specific image of him.
Every paper seemed to want to make me look like a dumb, fat slob.
The father who embarrassed himself before the royal wedding, the man mocked in headlines, the figure many were encouraged to dismiss before hearing him out. That version became the accepted one because it was easy, convenient, and useful. But beneath that image is a different question. Why was he speaking publicly at all?
I didn't do it for money. I did this to change my image.
By his own account, he had already tried the private route. Calls, messages, attempts to reach out through ordinary channels. And according to him, what came back was not confrontation, not closure, not even rejection. It was silence. And sometimes silence says more than anger ever could.
My daughter told me that when I reach my senior years, she'll take care of me.
That kind of silence does something to a person. It makes them go back through every memory, every conversation, every missed signal, searching for the exact moment when the relationship changed. And for Thomas Markle, that seems to be the most haunting part of all. Not simply that things became distant, but that he kept looking for the break and could never clearly find it. He was not just saying that Meghan changed. People change all the time, especially when fame, power, and public scrutiny enter the picture. That alone would not be shocking. What made his account more unsettling was how precise it felt. He was describing 2 completely different versions of the same person existing at the same time. There was the Meghan the public saw, warm, graceful, emotionally open, speaking about gratitude, family, and connection in a way that made people feel they were witnessing sincerity. Then there was the Meghan he says he experienced privately, distant, unreachable, and sealed off behind layers he could not cross.
I don't care. I mean, at this point, they owe me.
To Thomas, these were not slight differences in perspective. They were 2 separate realities. That contradiction is what gives this story its weight. Many people watched her interviews and felt moved by what seemed like genuine reflection about family and the people who shaped her life. It sounded heartfelt. It sounded grounded. It sounded believable. But from Thomas's point of view, that image was not a mirror of reality. It was a presentation, a carefully sustained version of closeness that looked convincing from the outside while leaving the person who raised her on the outside looking in. And that is where the discomfort sets in.
I don't care. I mean, at this point, they owe me.
Here is someone publicly speaking about family with tenderness and appreciation, while her father, by his own account, could not even reach her directly. The distance between those 2 images is enormous, and Thomas has spent years living inside that gap. What makes his account stand out is that he frames it less as anger and more as a kind of emotional burden. He was watching the world embrace a version of the story he believed was deeply incomplete, while knowing that speaking up would likely make him look unstable, and staying quiet would only strengthen the narrative further. Either way, he loses. And perhaps the most unsettling detail is this. He says he reached a point where even speaking to his own daughter felt controlled, filtered, and conditional. Not like a father reaching out to family, but like someone requesting access through a structure that no longer had room for him. That is not the natural fallout of fame. Fame can create distance, pressure, and confusion. But what Thomas Markle describes feels more structured than that. It feels like a system. And systems like that do not appear by accident. They are built over time, reinforced by patterns, and maintained with intention. Sit with that for a moment. Many people know what conflict looks like. A harsh argument, a slammed door, a final confrontation that leaves no doubt where things stand. But there is another kind of breakdown that can be even more unsettling, and it arrives without noise. It is managed silence, the kind of quiet that tells you everything while saying nothing at all. It is the kind where you reach for the phone, already knowing before you even make the call that nothing will come of it. No answer, no return call, no direct response, just the steady, controlled absence of connection. According to his own account, Thomas lived in that reality not for a short season, but for years. And what makes that especially painful is that it unfolded in full view of the public. While he was sitting with unanswered calls and messages that seemed to disappear into nowhere, the rest of the world was being shown something completely different. They were watching carefully framed interviews, public appearances, and emotional reflections centered on family, gratitude, and personal roots. They were seeing warmth. They were seeing sincerity. They were seeing someone presented as deeply connected to the people who shaped her life. And from Thomas's side, none of it matched what he was actually living through. That is what makes his account feel so difficult to ignore. It is not just about rejection. It is about the experience of watching the world affirm a story that feels completely disconnected from your private reality. Then the focus shifts to Doria, and the emotional weight changes again. If Thomas's story leaves frustration, Doria's account brings something quieter and heavier. A mother carries a different kind of history. She is tied to the earliest and most formative years of a child's life. That bond is not casual, and it is not easily explained away. Which is why the idea that even that relationship could become distant, filtered, or carefully managed feels so stark. Publicly, Doria was often seen as calm, poised, and supportive, standing beside her daughter during defining moments. It was an image of grace and closeness. But if her private experience tells a different story, then once again, the gap between appearance and reality becomes impossible to dismiss. Publicly, Doria Ragland often appeared to be exactly what people wanted to believe she was: steady, loving, and quietly present. She carried herself with a calm that felt genuine, and in a world filled with titles, formalities, and carefully choreographed appearances, she seemed to represent something more grounded. To many people, she looked like proof that beneath all the ceremony, there was still something intimate and real. She was seen as Meghan's anchor, the quiet presence that suggested an unshakable bond between mother and daughter. That image resonated because it felt believable. It felt natural. A mother standing beside her daughter during pivotal moments, offering support without spectacle, has a kind of emotional power that people immediately understand. It does not need explanation. It simply reads as love. But according to Doria's account, the connection people assumed they were seeing was more complicated than it appeared. The easy closeness many imagined was not always the reality behind the scenes. What looked effortless in photographs and public appearances may have concealed something far more structured in private. She describes a relationship that, over time, became increasingly formal. Not distant in the obvious sense, but regulated in a way that changed its entire emotional shape. Visits did not simply become less frequent because life was busy. They became arranged, timed, and slotted into place with the kind of precision people normally associate with work, not family. What should have felt spontaneous began to feel managed. And the detail that lingers most is the one that changes the emotional temperature of the entire story: the phone calls. Doria says that reaching her own daughter was not always a simple matter of picking up the phone and speaking when she wanted. It became something scheduled, something that had to be arranged in advance, not because of ordinary logistics, but because access itself had become controlled. That is the part that forces a harder question. If a mother has to book time just to speak with her daughter, then what exactly were those public moments showing the world? The warm photographs, the affectionate body language, the appearances that seemed so natural and reassuring. What were people really looking at? Were they witnessing a genuine reflection of the relationship, or were they seeing carefully selected moments that created the impression of a closeness that had become far more limited in private? That is where the story starts to feel less like ordinary family strain and more like something deliberately shaped. The real question is what kind of relationship existed beneath the images everyone was shown. According to Doria's account, many of their interactions seemed to happen when there was a reason for them to happen in public. A major appearance, a formal event, a moment where the image of a supportive, loving mother carried value. In those moments, the warmth appeared convincing. The smiles looked natural. The body language suggested affection and familiarity. But what makes her account so difficult to sit with is what she says happened once those moments ended. Once the cameras were gone and the public framing disappeared, the dynamic often changed. The closeness that seemed visible in one setting did not always carry forward into private life. It did not necessarily continue into the next conversation, the next visit, or the quiet spaces where real connection is usually most visible. That is the part that gives her story its emotional weight. What Doria seems to be describing is not dramatic rejection in the usual sense, but something more subtle and, in its own way, more painful. The feeling of being brought close when the image called for it and kept at a distance when it did not. Maybe not with open cruelty, maybe not with obvious malice, but functionally, the result was the same. Present when needed, less accessible when not. For a mother, that kind of experience carries a particular kind of hurt. This is someone who was there during the earliest years, who helped shape the person the world would later come to know, and who would naturally expect that bond to remain deeper than appearances. To feel that your presence matters most when it fits the moment and less when the moment passes is the sort of pain that is hard to describe because it does not always arrive as conflict. Sometimes it arrives as quiet displacement. And what makes Doria's account stand out is that she does not frame it with dramatic outrage. Her tone, as described here, feels more subdued than that. It sounds like the perspective of someone who loves deeply and has had to face the possibility that love alone was not enough to keep the connection open in the way it once was. Over time, access itself appears to have become conditional, timed, and carefully controlled. The mother who once knew every detail of her daughter's life could, in certain moments, feel more like a visitor than family. Then the story darkens further. Because Doria does not stop at describing her own sense of being edged outward. She begins to suggest something more deliberate behind the overall pattern. She hints that Thomas Markle's attempts to reach out, the calls, the messages, the repeated efforts to maintain some kind of contact may not have been fading into silence by accident. Instead, the implication is that those efforts were being quietly redirected in ways that kept the distance intact. That changes the shape of the story. It stops looking like ordinary drift and starts sounding like something more intentional. A pattern of decisions that kept certain people close enough to serve a purpose, but far enough to remain controlled. Not loudly, not in some obvious dramatic collapse. Quietly. That is what makes this kind of distance so hard to recognize while it is happening. The most effective forms of control rarely announce themselves. They settle in gradually, so smoothly and so consistently that by the time you can finally name the pattern, the space between people has already been built and accepted as normal. That is where Samantha Markle's account becomes important because her perspective adds a different layer to what Thomas and Doria describe. Thomas speaks from the place of hurt and confusion. Doria speaks from the place of loss and the slow fading of closeness. But Samantha describes something more structured. She does not just describe pain. She describes a way of operating. And once that framework is added, the broader picture becomes harder to ignore.
I would just say that there is so much water under the bridge and so much has spun out of control.
She is speaking as someone who shared a home, shared memories, and shared the kind of ordinary history that people assume can never really be erased. Siblings carry the private details no public biography ever captures. The jokes no one else understands. The awkward moments. The small daily routines that become the foundation of familiarity. Samantha seems to have believed that history would always remain intact simply because it had already been lived. What she describes is not a sudden break. It is something slower than that. Fame arrived, and with it came a gradual shift. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became shorter. Interactions began to feel filtered, as if something had placed a layer between them that had not existed before. It was not openly discussed, but it was there all the same. Over time, the sister she once knew directly began to feel like someone she had to navigate. According to this account, even basic communication no longer carried the ease you would expect between people who shared a childhood. At points, conversations reportedly moved through other people, routed and managed in a way that made access feel coordinated rather than natural. That is what gives Samantha's perspective its force. She is describing the unsettling experience of realizing that a relationship once built on ease had begun to feel controlled. From the outside, very little seemed wrong. Public moments still suggested affection. Appearances still created the impression of closeness.
Moving forward, I apologize and I wish things could be different.
To anyone watching casually, it could all look intact. But Samantha's point is that appearances can be deeply misleading. What people believed they were seeing was not necessarily what she was actually living. And that tension between the public image and the private experience is what makes her account so difficult to dismiss. By Samantha's account, even the smallest gestures began to feel measured. Nothing seemed casual anymore. Nothing felt spontaneous. It was as if every interaction had already been considered, weighed, and evaluated before it ever happened. Before warmth was shown, before time was given, before any visible sign of connection appeared, there was the sense that someone had already decided how it would look and whether it served a purpose. That is an exhausting thing to realize about someone you grew up with. Because once you see a pattern like that, even the moments that appear genuine begin to feel different. The smiles at public events, the brief exchanges, the occasional appearances that seem to suggest familiarity and affection. To an outside audience, those moments can look completely natural, but when you have experienced enough of the private version to recognize the contrast, those same moments stop reading as simple connection. They begin to feel curated. Samantha describes a specific kind of pain that does not come from open conflict. It comes from being quietly sidelined, not loudly rejected, not publicly cut off, just kept at a distance in a way that is subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation while still making the message clear.
I was hoping that maybe we would have the chance to speak, that she would know I was here, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Present when useful, peripheral the rest of the time. And in her case, the hurt seems to take on another layer. Thomas was trying to reach his daughter and facing silence. Doria was describing access that had become scheduled and limited. Samantha's experience, as she frames it, carries the feeling of being replaced, not by another person, but by a public version of the relationship that looked acceptable from the outside. That may be one of the most unsettling parts of all. It is not only about distance, it is about watching a version of your bond be presented to the world while knowing that the private reality no longer matches it. That is where her account shifts from personal hurt to something more pointed. She suggests that these family moments were not simply awkward or occasional attempts at keeping up appearances. She implies they were carefully thought through, assembled with purpose, almost as if each interaction had a role to play before it even began. Not just a family moment captured on camera, but a moment shaped in advance to produce a specific impression. And that is what makes the claims so uncomfortable. If every family interaction is filtered through the question of how it should look and what it should accomplish, then the relationship itself starts to feel secondary to the image being created. Samantha goes even further by suggesting that this did not stop with her. Even the public moments involving Doria, the ones that seemed warm, natural, and deeply loving, were, in her view, not necessarily expressions of private closeness. They may have been timed and framed around what those moments needed to communicate publicly rather than what the relationship actually was in private. That is the point where this stops sounding like ordinary family distance and starts sounding like something deliberately managed. A mother and daughter appearing together should naturally read as something real. It should feel unforced, instinctive, and rooted in a bond that exists whether anyone is watching or not. But if that connection is being presented because the moment requires it, rather than because the relationship itself is truly operating that way in private, then the entire image takes on a different meaning. Doria Ragland is not a publicist. She is not a strategist. She is a mother. And if even that relationship was being shaped around optics more than genuine closeness, then a great deal of what people thought they were seeing has to be reconsidered. That is what pushes this story beyond ordinary family strain. At a certain point, it stops sounding like personal grievance and starts looking like a consistent pattern. Thomas, Doria, and Samantha are not speaking from the same emotional position. They do not have the same relationship to Meghan, and they do not carry the same history. A father sees one kind of loss. A mother feels another. A sister experiences something else entirely. There is no natural reason for all three perspectives to align in such a specific way unless they are all pointing toward the same underlying reality. And that is exactly what makes their accounts so difficult to wave away. All three describe interactions that became scheduled and managed in ways that replaced ordinary connection. All three describe a public image that seemed warm and intact, while private access grew narrower, more controlled, and more conditional. All three describe the same feeling of closeness being performed outwardly, while the actual relationships behind the scenes were held at a careful distance. That kind of consistency matters. One person can be dismissed as having a grievance. Two people may suggest a pattern. But three people, each coming from a different role, a different emotional history, and a different vantage point, all landing on the same essential conclusion, create something harder to ignore. At that point, the question changes. The real issue is no longer whether fame can create distance. Of course it can. The deeper question is whether this was simple drift, or something more intentional. There is a difference between someone becoming overwhelmed by a changing life and gradually losing touch, and someone actively maintaining distance while preserving the appearance of closeness. One is human frailty. The other is deliberate design. What Thomas, Doria, and Samantha each describe points toward the second possibility. Not a story of accidental separation, but a story of image management. A story in which charm, access, timing, and a clear understanding of how narratives are built may have shaped what the public believed, even while the private reality looked very different. And the people left carrying the cost of that difference were not strangers. They were the people who knew her before the world did. The people who were there first. The people who, in any ordinary understanding of family, should have been closest to the truth. The real weight of this story is not in the headlines or the spectacle. It is in the human cost. Strip away the public noise, and what remains is something far more difficult to sit with. The quiet damage done when a relationship is not formally ended, but slowly emptied out until only the outline of it remains. Thomas Markle's part in that cost is especially painful to consider. Imagine the moment a father stops waiting for the phone to ring. The moment he no longer checks for a missed call. The moment he accepts, not in anger, but in silence, that no response is coming. That is not just disappointment. It is a kind of grief that rarely has words around it, because nothing has been declared finished. The person is still alive, still visible, still admired by the world. But in your own life, what remains is absence. Doria's version of that loss feels different, but no less profound. She is a mother who, by this account, had to let go of spontaneity. She had to adjust her love to fit within limited, structured windows of access. She had to take something as instinctive as a mother's desire to call, to check in, to be present without permission, and compress it into whatever moments were made available. That is a painful discipline to impose on someone whose bond should not need approval or scheduling to exist. Then there is Samantha, whose loss seems rooted in something quieter but equally devastating. She describes the experience of becoming peripheral in a story she once belonged to naturally, not dramatically cut out, not openly pushed away, just gradually reduced until the public version of the family no longer seemed to have room for the truth of who she was within it. It is one thing to feel distant. It is another to watch a version of the relationship continue to exist publicly, while your real place inside it fades. And that may be what makes all of this land so heavily. None of them are describing a stranger. In some ways, that would be easier. A total break, a clean transformation, a person becoming unrecognizable. But that is not what they are saying. What they seem to be saying is more painful than that. They still recognize her. They still care. They still hold on to the memory of who she was to them. Their pain comes not from total disconnection, but from the belief that someone they still love made a series of choices that created and preserved distance where closeness once existed. That is the part that does not fit neatly into a tabloid frame. It is not just a story about conflict. It is a story about what happens when the version of a person presented to the world begins to matter more than the relationships that existed before the world was watching. And the people who carry the cost of that shift are often the ones who knew them first. At this point, skepticism is fair. Thomas has spoken publicly before. Samantha has also made her views known. Doria has often appeared publicly supportive. Those facts matter, and no one should be asked to set aside common sense. But even with that skepticism intact, one thing remains difficult to explain away. The convergence. 3 separate people, different motivations, different histories, different roles, yet all describing the same basic pattern of managed access, curated closeness, and a gap between public image and private reality. That does not automatically make every detail beyond question, but it does make the pattern itself harder to dismiss, and it raises a more serious possibility than simple family drift. Not that public life created distance by accident, but that public life may have become the cover under which that distance was maintained. That distinction matters. Pressure can explain strain. Fame can explain awkwardness. Constant scrutiny can explain why relationships become harder to navigate. But those things do not fully explain a system of scheduled access. They do not explain a mother needing to arrange time to speak. They do not explain repeated efforts being rerouted through layers of control. Those details suggest something more deliberate than simple overwhelm. And that is why this story feels larger than one family or one public figure. At its core, it is about a universal tension, the difference between the version of ourselves we present to the world and the version the people closest to us actually live with. It is about the cost of that gap when it grows too wide. It is about what happens to the people who keep loving, keep waiting, and keep trying, even when the space between image and reality keeps expanding. So the question this leaves behind is not only about Meghan Markle, it is about anyone who builds a public identity. When the people who knew you before the world did, a parent, a sibling, the people who shaped your earliest life, all independently describe the same kind of distance, what does that say? Is it ever possible for image to become more important than the people behind it? And if that happens slowly enough, would you even recognize it in yourself before the damage was already done? And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Not that the world was given a story. Public figures always shape stories. That is nothing new. It is that the story so many people believed may have come at the expense of the people who were there before any cameras, before any titles, before any carefully managed image ever existed. Because when you strip all of this down, what is left is not just controversy, it is not just family dysfunction, it is not just another headline designed to spark outrage for a few days and disappear. What is left is a much harder question about what happens when image becomes so valuable that reality starts getting edited to protect it. Thomas, Doria, and Samantha are not describing one bad argument or one misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. They are describing something slower, colder, and far more difficult to repair. A pattern, a structure, a way of keeping certain people close enough to preserve the appearance of connection, while holding them far enough away that the real relationship no longer threatens the version being sold to the world. And if that is true, then this story is not really about royalty, celebrity, or tabloid fascination. It is about what happens when someone becomes so committed to managing how they are seen that the people who knew them most intimately become secondary to the narrative. That is the real fracture here. Not public embarrassment. Not online debate. The fracture between performance and truth. Because the truth, as these three accounts suggest, is not loud. It does not always arrive in some dramatic revelation. Sometimes it shows up years later in the voices of the people who stopped waiting, stopped expecting, and finally decided that silence was no longer enough. And once that kind of truth surfaces, it changes everything. Because you can argue with one voice, maybe even dismiss two, but three separate lives pointing to the same pattern is where denial starts to lose its grip. So now the story sits where it always should have been, not in polished interviews or carefully framed appearances, but in the uncomfortable space between what the world was shown and what the people closest to it say they actually lived. That is where the real story begins, and that is where the public has to decide what it believes. If this story hit you the way it hit me, drop your thoughts below and say what you think the real turning point was. And if you want more deep dives that go past the polished image and into the details people keep missing, make sure you stay locked in with BarzBuzz, because we are not done pulling this apart. If this saga had you shook, wait till you see what's next. You already know what it is. BarzBuzz got the real, raw, and unfiltered breakdowns. So don't forget to like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to catch up.